What's up creators, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to try to replicate the style of Filipe Pinhas in Lightroom. So as always, this style was a suggestion by a couple of you guys in the comment section on previous videos. So again, if you have any video that you want me to make or style that you want me to break down, put it down in the comment section and I'll check it out. So you know how this works. First of all, we're going to check out some examples of images shot by him and edited by him, start breaking down what he does in the color grading department. So when we jump into Lightroom, we have the knowledge to edit a photo and create a preset out of it. So here we have Filipe's profile, Filipe Pinhas, if you want to go and follow him and support him. And just taking a broader look at his feed, we can notice that most of the images are shot either in moody days, whether it be misty, rainy, snowy days, or at sundown, where the light is evenly diffused and we don't have that harsh contrast of the midday. Now, of course, we do have some exceptions where he does have a very contrasty situation, but in general, he likes to shoot in an even lit scenario. So we always have to keep this in mind when we're trying to replicate a look that we're shooting or editing images in a similar type of scenario. So let's go deeper into the analysis. Let's talk about, first of all, the exposure and contrast. And right here, something that comes to mind when I'm looking at his images is that it's very rare that we're going to have any pure whites or overblown highlights. And this is just a consequence of shooting in a moody day, but also because he's bringing down the highlights, bringing down the whites, so we have more information in these areas of the image. He also does the same with the shadows. We have a lot of detail in the dark points of the image. Where this is a bit different is in the blacks. Sometimes in the blacks he goes way down, so we're losing a lot of detail in the dark points on our image, creating these very contrasty looks. But in particular in this image, I can see that he applied some gradients over here to the top right corner and to the bottom left corner, just to make our emphasis on the central subject. But in general, he plays around with the blacks quite a bit. Sometimes it's very intense. In other cases, like in this image, the blacks are basically non-existent. Instead of blacks, we have some grayish tones. So we can create this variation in the tone curve, and as you will see in a couple of seconds, he has loads of variations on his style. It's not a nailed down specific look. Now moving into the color grading, his overall palette is very desaturated. We can see all the blues, all the aquas, all the greens, all the magentas, all the cool tones are going to be greatly desaturated. In some cases, so much that it's almost looking like a pastel look. In other cases, like in the previous image that we saw, it's basically black and white. The two colors that are going to remain a bit more saturated are going to be the oranges and the reds. Therefore, the skin tones are going to be greatly highlighted in his images. Now, in general, most of his skin tones are tending more towards the orangey tones rather than to the pinks. And we can see this in this image. And in some cases, we can see it a lot more extreme. For example, in this image of this fisher, you can see his hands are very vibrant, very saturated and very orange. And this is an indication for me that he's playing around with camera calibration to accentuate these colors and this part of the gamma. Now in this image, don't pay attention to the complete desaturation of all the other hues, but right here, this ice cream bar and this logo that we have over here, in my country it's called Holland, right here it's called Hola, but this should be a scarlet red or more of a pinkish red. And as you can see, it's completely orange. This is just corroborating what he does with the reds, just changing them towards the orange side. So what I've mentioned up until now is a constant throughout all his images, the desaturated cold tones and the contrast and exposure. And from here, he goes around and creates several variations on his style. In my opinion, he has loads of presets that he applies into his feed, but they have a lot of things in common. So the first style that we're going to check out is this one, which is a very black and white looking image, with the exception of the warm tones as we mentioned. But notice how in the shadows we don't have any hint of blue or aqua, which is very natural that in the shadows we can have some cool tones appearing. Right here, they're basically black and white, creating this very dramatic image. So this could be the neutral variant. Then a second preset could be this one, where he's filling that desaturated void that we created with a blue tone in the dark points on our image. In this case, for this image, is in the blacks. In other cases, it draws out towards the shadows. And in this image in particular, notice how most of the image is covered in blue because it's in the shadow ranges. But notice how the whites in our image, any part of the image that should be white, is very yellow. This is telling me that in color grading, he's adding a blue to the shadows and a yellow towards the highlights. This is creating color contrast, because blues and yellows are direct opposite in the color wheels. So it's creating a very nice or balanced looking palette in terms of color. Then in other cases, notice how this blue is a lot more saturated, and then he combines it with a lot more contrast to create more of a dramatic image. So he plays around with the saturation and the intensity of this hue that he's adding into the shadows. Now, a third variant could be this one, where instead of a blue, we have an emerald or aqua-like color, more like a mint color, added to the shadows, and it's creating some contrast with the oranges, which are naturally accentuated by the movements that we did before in camera calibration. This could be a third preset. And then a fourth variant could be this one, which is a bit more different to the previous three. Right here, we have more of a contrasty look, a lot more intensity in the shadows and the blacks. He's not afraid to lower them to have a contrast. And instead of having a cool tone, all the image is being covered with a warm tone, and he applies this preset into mostly warm scenarios or warm images. So right here, he's not afraid to add more punch, more intensity into the shadows and blacks to create a more of a dramatic image. Now, when we're breaking down styles, we need to train our eye and differentiate what is done on field, what is done in color grading, and what is done in post-masking or post-edition. For example, most of his images have a lot of retouching. Right here in this image of this couple, we can see that at the top we have a gradient coming in from the top right corner towards the bottom and darkening this area, and we have another one from the left bottom going up, and then the two central subjects have a bit of a brush tool applied, so we're creating this highlighted effect and drawing our attention towards the central subject. In this other image over here, this is, as we can see by the shadows, it's a very sunny day, and then he's applying this gradient filter or gradient mask at the top left corner and creating this mist type effect. But we all know that this is a very sunny day, and just adding a lot of retouching. So this is a constant that we're going to see throughout these images. So you always have to keep in mind that a lot of his work, or why his images are so impactful, is because of the retouching. So that's it for the analysis, guys. Now let's jump into Lightroom and start recreating his looks. But before that, I'm just going to remind you that these 4 presets that we're going to create today are included in the EDILAC preset pack V4. So we're in the 4th season of the EDILAC series, and as we continue to analyze more styles throughout this entire season, all the presets are going to be added into this pack. So that's a great way you can skip all my tutorials, but in the process you can support me. So don't worry if you purchase it early, where you only have a handful of presets, you're still gonna have access to the presets that we add in the future. So check out the EDILAC V4 up here, and also just browse on my shop. Maybe you find my personal LUTs or presets that I use every single day to edit my videos like this one, or my photos on Instagram in a faster manner helpful. And if you can support me by purchasing anything over there, I'll be very thankful, so I continue to do videos for you guys. And if it's not on your possibilities, don't worry, let's jump into Lightroom and let's start editing. So creators, here I am in Lightroom Classic, and I have this little collection. Don't worry, we're not gonna edit all of these images. I'm just gonna edit one and then test out the presets in different scenarios to see if we did a good job. So I think I'm gonna select this one down here, and with D on my keyboard, I'm gonna move to the develop module. So starting out, we're gonna create the base preset, or the natural variant that has that desaturated cold tones, but also the contrast as we saw in the example images. And then from that one, we're gonna create the variants. So we don't have to start from scratch to create every single preset. So first of all, let's move on to the exposure and contrast with the basic correction tools, the presence tab and the tone curve. And then we're gonna move down into the color grading down here. Now starting out, we're gonna omit these values that we have over here in contrast, exposure, and temperature and tint, because these are the values that I like to use to compensate maybe if my image was poorly shot on field. For example, this image, I already added a 1.09 stops of exposure, because if I deactivate it, you can see that this image was underexposed on field, and that this happens to me a lot. Sometimes I rely too much in post-edition instead of nailing down my shots on field. But that's just my mistakes, rookie mistakes, and don't pay attention to these values for starters. Let's move down to the highlights. First of all, highlights. We want to achieve a bit more information in the shadows, but also in the highlights. So the highlights, we're not going to go towards the positives, otherwise we'll lose information in the bright points. We're going to go towards the negatives, and not too much, so our image is completely flat, but maybe around the -15, -20, you guys can play around. And then with the shadows, in my case, I want to achieve a bit more detail in the dark points on our image in these areas over here. And I'm going to go towards the positives, not too high. This is way too much, but just around the +15 is just going to be enough. Now, you guys can go ahead and maybe from here add more contrast. Sometimes Filipe had some images that had loads of information, like in this one where the image is very flat, and others like this one that has too much contrast and we're losing a lot of information. And in this case, if you want to go for that latter style, I would recommend you guys to go towards the negatives with the shadows, to lose some information in the shadows and achieve a more dramatic edit with more contrast. But in this case, I'm going to go to a +15. Next up, whites will control the brightest points on our image, but I'm not going to move them right here. I'm going to move them further along in the tone curve. Meanwhile, blacks, I am just going to return a bit of the strength to the blacks towards the negatives, not too much. Otherwise, our image is very contrasty and dramatic, but ever so slightly around the -15, just to retain a bit of the strength in the blacks. Okay, next we're going to move down to the tone curve. Now in the tone curve, we can do basically what we did in the basic corrections, but right here we have a bit more freedom as our image is not divided into 4 sliders. Right here in the tone curve, we can divide our image, and this line will be the representation of our image, divided into the amount of parts that we want to edit specific areas in terms of contrast and exposure. So it gives us a lot of freedom if you know how to use it. So this line represents our image, and if you drag any part of our image towards the bottom right corner, it will darken it, and to the top left corner, it will brighten it up. Now in Filipe's profile, we saw a great variety of styles, and in some cases the blacks were very natural, very contrasty, pure blacks, but in other cases they were very grayed out, like in this image where we have non-existent blacks, they're basically gray. So you can achieve this faded look here in the tone curve. This point at the bottom left corner will control our blacks, and right here they're in the natural point. But if you drag this point up, you can see how our blacks start to shift into grayish tones, and if you go high enough, well, they're basically now faded completely away. So you guys can play around, you can leave it at 0. In my case, I'm just going to drag it ever so slightly up, very slightly, with a value of 10 in the output, just making our blacks a little bit grayish. If you compare it to the interface on Lightroom over here, you can see a slight shift towards the grayish tones. Now by moving this point up a bit, what happened is that we also brightened up a bit of our shadows over here, because the tone curve acts as a curve and it also affects other areas on our image. So I'm going to create a point right here. I'm going to drag it just into the diagonal that we have as a reference for our original settings. So drag it a bit down to the coordinates of 41 in the input and 41 in the output, just retaining the contrasty shadows that we already applied in the basic corrections. Then this point at the top right corner will control our whites. So I'm not going to go towards the left, otherwise we increase the intensity and the contrast. I'm going to go a bit towards the bottom, not too much, otherwise our image is completely flat and unnatural. I'm going to go maybe with a value. The value in the output is 239, just reducing a bit of the intensity of any bright points on our image. Okay, so I'm almost finished with the exposure and contrast, ready to move down into the color grading. But one thing that I'm going to do is move the presence tab that we have over here, and this is going to be a bit optional for you guys depending on what you want. But one thing that I observed in most of the images of Filipe is that he took away a bit of the digital sharpness and contrast of his images to make them look a bit more soft and a bit more pleasing. So you can do this in the presence tab with the texture. As you can see, if I zoom in into any detailed part of our image, if I add texture towards the positives, everything becomes a bit more sharp, very sharp and unnatural. This is digital sharpness. I'm going to go a bit more towards the negatives, not towards the extreme. Otherwise our image is very soft, but maybe around the -15 is just going to be enough. Just reducing a bit of the sharpness of our image. Clarity will add more contrast into the midtones towards the positives. It's way too contrasty. I want to go towards the negatives as well. Not too much, otherwise it's very soft, but maybe around the 15 or again is going to be the value. And then the haze will add or reduce haze in our image. And what I observed is that he added negative dehaze just to add a bit more of a glowing effect, simulating haze effect into his images to make them a bit more washed out. So if I go all the way to the extreme, notice how our image is very soft and it starts to wash out all the colors, all the contrast starts to disappear. I don't want to go too high, but maybe around the -15 is going to be a good value, just to leave it over there and create a very dreamy-like effect. Now, in most of his images, as I mentioned, he does do a lot of retouching, and in that retouching, he adds a lot of dehaze. For example, in this image of this old couple, you can see how they basically glow, or the central subject start to glow a bit, and this is just a byproduct of a dehaze towards the negative. So we can add it over here in a -15 in a very conservative value, and then if you want to apply a bit more, you can add it with the masking tools within Lightroom. Okay, now let's move down into the color grading, and let's start off with the color mixer, otherwise known as HSL. Right here, what we want to do is achieve that desaturated palette. So we want to desaturate most of the cold tones. So I'm going to be a bit extreme over here with the magentas. I'm going to go around the -70 to all the values in the cold range. So -70 over here. Well, magentas and purples technically are in the warmer side of the spectrum, but I'm just going to go to -70 with all these colors. You guys can play around, maybe go a bit less, but aquas, greens, blues, all of them are going to go to -70s, and the yellows will control a lot of the lighter greens, as you can see over here. So again, I'm going to go with a -70 as well over here. And here we have a very desaturated palette, and notice how the warm tones in our image take a lot more relevance because, well, the other colors are very muted. Now right here, I am going to desaturate a bit the red tones and the oranges to a -10, and these ones will affect a bit of the skin tones in the majority of the cases. But right here, we have a very muted and desaturated palette. We can deactivate color mixer, this before and after. We're just draining all of the cool tones on our image and creating this void of color. So when we move into creating the different variants, we're going to fill that void with the specific color that we have in mind. Okay, next up in terms of color, one thing that we need to nail down is the orangey skin tones. Now, right here, our person that we have on frame, well, she has very pale, very white skin tones. This isn't gonna work. We're not gonna see great changes over here. So what I'm gonna do is copy these settings with right click, settings, and then copy settings. And I'm gonna move into another image just to nail down the skin tones. So for example, I have this artist in Florence. Let's right click, settings, and paste the settings, and let's nail down those skin tones. So as you can see, immediately we have a change in the terms of the exposure and contrast. We have a more of a controlled exposure, and also we have a very muted palette. Now let's zoom into the skin tones. And right here, I'm going to go down into camera calibration over here and change the skin tones to make them a lot more vibrant and a lot more orange. So first of all, red primary, we don't want to go towards the negatives, otherwise our skin tones tend towards the magentas. We want to go a bit more towards the positives. Not too high, otherwise our skin tones change towards the yellows and the greens, so be a bit careful. But just a value around the 20s is going to be enough in this case. Plus 17 is going to be a nice value. And then I'm going to use the blue primary to add more intensity and more vibrance. Now you may be asking yourselves, why blue primary? Because as I mentioned in the analysis, blue is direct opposite to the yellow. They're complementary colors. And as you can see over here in a color wheel, blue is in the other side of the yellow. And by moving camera calibration, by moving the blue primary, you're affecting the blue, but also you're affecting the direct opposite in the same sense, which is the yellow. So just push around the saturation towards the positives and notice how the yellows or any color in the image which is composed of blue and yellow starts to acquire more saturation and more vibrancy. So I'm going to go quite high, around the plus 90, and you can notice the shift, notice the skin tone. This is before and after, and now they have that yellowish or orangey tint that we had in the example images, but with a lot more saturation. Now I know that some of you guys edit in Lightroom Mobile, and that's the only version of Lightroom that doesn't have camera calibration. So what you can do is go up into color mixer and we'll compensate some of the values just to achieve this similar look. So you can reduce a bit of the desaturation that we added into the red and the orange. You're going to move up maybe the luminance of the orange just to brighten the skin tones up just a bit. And also in the hue, you're going to make these changes that I'm also going to do right here, even though I already have camera calibration, just to intensify the orangey look. So the oranges, I'm not going to go towards the positives, otherwise we shift our tones into greens. I'm going to go a bit towards the negatives, ever so slightly around the -8 is going to be enough. But you guys, if you don't have camera calibration, you can go further down just to compensate, but I'm going to leave it around the -10, -8. And then the reds, not towards the magentas, but towards the oranges, towards the positives, maybe around the 15 is going to be enough. Okay, so our base preset or our neutral variant is basically finished, but I'm just going to add a little bit of a detail over here. I'm going to go down into the color grading, and in color grading you can add a tint into the shadows, into the midtones, or into the highlights. I'm just going to add a bit of warmth into the highlights just to make emphasis on the warm tones on our image. So in the highlight wheel over here, I'm going to add a bit of a hue. I'm going to play around, and I'm going to go maybe with a hue around the 50, and the saturation, just play around. It's way too much. It's going to be very subtle, maybe around the 10% to 15% is going to be enough, and it's a very subtle effect. If you zoom in into any white point on our image, we can see if I deactivate this, this is before and after, and it's a very subtle change. Maybe it's barely noticeable on YouTube, but it's adding a bit of warmth into our highlights. Okay, so our neutral variant is basically finished right here. We can see the before and after with white on our keyboard, and you can see how we have a very muted palette. All the cold tones, all the blues and the shadows and the backgrounds are basically gone, and we're just left with the warm tones. We have those faded blacks, and we have a very nice contrast. Obviously, you guys, if you wanted to go for a more contrasty version, you can play around with the basic corrections and the tone curve over here. Maybe drag down the shadows to achieve more dramatic image. It all depends on what you're going for, but I'm happy with these results. Now let's save this preset and see how it performs in a couple of other images before we create some variants. So to save a preset, we're going to go to the left panel over here, and the presets, hit the plus sign and create preset. Here you're going to name it, and you're going to mark all the tools that we used, and the white balance, exposure, and contrast, we're going to uncheck them. So we're going to have free reign to use these to compensate anything that we didn't do well on field, and we're gonna hit create. Okay, so quickly, let's see how the preset performs in this image of this old man that looks like Stan Lee. So let's apply the preset over here, TFA, Filipe Pinhas neutral, and we can see the change. Immediately, you can notice I have a softer looking exposure because that's what I went for. Have those blues, which are basically drawn away from our image. I notice the difference in terms of the reds and the skin tones compared to our original image. The reds are more towards the orangey tones like we saw in the example images. Those skin tones are a lot more orange, and I think we did quite a good job over here. Obviously, guys, remember that you can play around with the amount slider. If you want more of a dramatic look, more of a softer look, play around with the amount slider. And then obviously you can play around with the contrast slider that we have over here. Just play around with the contrast depending on what you're looking for. But I think we did quite a good job over here. Okay, so that's the natural variant, very desaturated and very muted. Now from that one, we can create the other variants. Let's start off with the cobalt version. Now there's one tool that's gonna allow us to create all these variants, and that's gonna be color grading. So right here I have this image in the library on New York. So first of all, let's apply our neutral variant to use as a basis. And we can notice the slight shift in terms of the contrast and also the desaturation on the cool tones over here. So we're going to move down into color grading over here. And first of all, to create the cobalt version, we're just going to add into the shadows any specific hue that we want. So I'm going to go to the saturation towards the positives. I'm going to play around to find the correct color. And we did see a lot of variation in terms of the blues in his feed. But in this case, I think I'm going to go with this one, which is a color that we saw more often than not in his images. And the saturation is going to be quite high. In this case, it's going to be around the 40%. Now in this image, you can see how our blacks, how our shadows are being painted with this cobalt blue, and it's looking very nice. You can deactivate the shadows over here. This is before and after, and it's looking fantastic. Now you guys can also play around with the saturation to make it a lot more intense, or just drag it a bit down, but I'm going to leave it quite high, around the plus 40. And also I'm leaving the yellow tone that we added in the highlight just to compensate and create this color contrast. Now, as we saw in some of the images that Filipe edited, sometimes the blues were very reserved into only the darkest points on our image, the blacks, and in other cases, the blues were all over the image. Now you can control this with these two sliders that we have down here. Blending will determine if the blues that you added in the shadows are going to be applied only into the shadows if you go all the way to those zeros towards the left, and the blues are going to be very strictly applied into the shadow ranges. Or if you go towards the plus 100, you can see how the blue starts to appear in the bright points on our image as well, and it's just going to be a mesh of blue and yellow that we have in the highlight ranges over here. So for this preset of Filipe, I advise you guys to go to those zeros. So our blues or our emeralds that we add in the shadows are only applied into the specific areas that we wanted. Now balance is very important to achieving the desired look with these presets that we're creating today. Why? Because as you can see, color grading works with the exposure of your image, but not all images are shot with the same type of exposure. Some of them are a bit darker, some of them are a bit brighter. Therefore, what Lightroom is considering as shadows and as highlights is going to shift or differ from an image to an image, and therefore you can use the balance slider over here to tell Lightroom where you want the blue in your image. So for example, in this image, if I wanted only the black points like this coat to be painted with the blue, but not the shadows, I would need to move around the balance slider. So if I go all the way towards the negatives, I'm telling Lightroom that all the image is being considered as shadows, and therefore, as you can see, the bright points on our image are also being painted with the blue. But if I want to be a bit more precise, I'm going to go towards the positives and notice how the blue starts to disappear from the midtones, from the shadows. And right now, you can basically only see a blue tone added into the blacks. You can deactivate to make shadows to make it a bit more clear. You can deactivate this. This is before and after. And as you can see, the blue is very timid, but it's just right there in the deepest point on our image. So guys, when you're applying these presets that we're creating today, always remember that you need to adjust and play around with the balance slider in the color grading to make them work for every specific image. Okay, so that was a bit long-winded, but let's save this preset and now let's create the emerald variant. So I have this image over here. Let's apply the preset and let's test it out before we create the emerald version. So this is the cobalt version, and as you can see, it paints a dark point on our image with this blue hue, and it's quite nice. And again, you would use the balance slider over here, depending if you want the blues to be a bit more reserved, more towards the positives, only applying into the blacks. Or if you go towards the negatives, you can see how the blues take a bit more relevance and start bleeding into other areas of the image, making our style a lot more dramatic. And once again, guys, the values that I'm introducing into these presets are just personal values. You guys, if you want a contrasty version, go ahead and add it. If you want more saturation, go ahead and add it. Right here, for me, it looks fantastic. We have a very nice blue, very similar to the blue that we saw in the example images of Filipe, and looks fantastic. Again, play around, maybe move the balance slider to add more blue into more parts of the image, or reduce it and just confine it into dark points on our image, or maybe just add more contrast by lowering a bit of the shadows in the tone curve over here. It all depends on what you're going for, but I think we did quite a good job with this cobalt version. Now, taking advantage that we're in this very nice image, let's move down into color grading again, and let's create the emerald version. Now, the hue for this variant of the preset should be around this range with the mints, the emeralds, and the greens, but I'm not quite sure. So when I'm not sure, what I like to use is the eyedropper tool. So let me just make this a bit smaller and make a bit of space over here. And at the background, I have my reference photo with the emerald color that we want. And what we're gonna do is select this little square that we have over here. And I'm gonna select the eyedropper over here. Now, right click and keep it pressed. And then you're gonna drag it into a part of the image which should be neutral. Neutral colors, well, we don't have any color, will be black, gray, or white. So any of the areas of the image that shouldn't have any hue, you're gonna drag the eyedropper and you're gonna find the correct hue. So right here, as you can see, our color grading is bouncing around the 200 of the hue and the saturation of the 60s or something around these values. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. I'm just gonna drag it over here and that's gonna be enough. So I'm just gonna make this big again. And the hue, I'm gonna leave it at 200, which is the whereabouts where the eyedropper was bouncing around. And the saturation, I'm just gonna leave it around the 40, just gonna leave it the same as we added into the cobalt version. And right here, we have this very nice emerald color added into the shadows. And again, just like in the cobalt version, blending at 0, and you're gonna play around with the balance tool over here to adjust it depending on how much emerald you want in your entire image. Now, before this video turns into a 3-hour-long video, now let's create the final variant, which is the contrasty version, the warm variant. And for that, first of all, I'm just gonna reset the color grading over here. Just gonna double click the shadows. We don't want any blue tone or emerald tone in the shadows. Just gonna double click. And the hue that we added into the highlights over here, I'm gonna right click, copy settings. I'm gonna reset the highlights. And instead, I'm gonna apply the warmth into the global color wheel. So all our image is a bit warmer than usual. So right click, paste settings. And now all our image shadows, midtones, and highlights are gonna be painted with a little bit of a warmth. Then I'm gonna go up into the tone curve. I'm gonna add that contrast that we saw in this version of the preset. So first of all, in the shadows, I'm gonna go with the shadows towards the negatives, not towards the positives, just adding a bit more contrast. And finally, in the tone curve here, I'm gonna add a lot more contrast. So I'm gonna reset this tone curve by right click, reset channel. So it's by default. Here, what I'm gonna do is add more difference between the whites and the blacks. So I'm gonna add more contrast. So blacks, I'm gonna go no towards the positives, otherwise we'll introduce more brightness. I'm gonna go towards the right to introduce more contrast and more strength. Not too much, otherwise this is too contrasty, but ever so slightly around the -10 is gonna be enough. The input is gonna be 10, output at 0, and then we have more intense blacks. And then the whites, at this point, I'm gonna drag it towards the left to add more intensity into the bright points on our image. With the input value of 242, the output is gonna be 255, it should be, in order for us to have this very dramatic contrast on our image. So this is the warm variant. I'm gonna save it. Maybe if it's a bit too contrasty for you guys, you can bring back a bit of the blacks, a bit of the whites. But in this case, I really like it. Now, one thing that you always have to keep in mind when looking at Filipe's images or any creator on Instagram is that yes, there is a lot of color grading, but the other part is the masking, the gradients, the radial filters, the brushes. All of those tools come into play when you're looking at the final result, and that's why his images look so fantastic. So for example, in this image, if I go to my masks over here, this image I edited a long time ago and I added this mask, and you can look at this image on my Instagram. But if I apply the mask, which is hidden away, you can see how the masking really draws up the production value. And this is very similar type of mask that he adds in his images, where he's adding a lot of the haze that we mentioned in the start of the video. So right here, this mask, well, it's basically just a brush tool, accentuating the bright points of the image and the subjects. And then what I'm doing down here is just adding some negative dehaze all the way to the -46 to add this glowing effect and really highlighting the areas of the image that I want the viewer to pose their vision into. So as you can see, if I reduce the haze, this is before and after, it just creates this dreamy effect, drawing the attention of the viewer towards the area that I'm selecting and highlighting over here. Also, I added some clarity over here just to add a bit more punch in my original mask, but this isn't really necessary. So guys, my apologies that I don't have any street photography in moody scenarios, but let's see how the preset performs in this image. Let's apply first of all the neutral variant. Here you can notice how there's that desaturation in the cold tones. Then the cobalt version looks quite nice, adding this blue hue into the shadows. You obviously play around with the balance slider over here to make it a lot more emphatic, a lot more subtle. And then the emerald version looks fantastic. I really like this preset. In this case, this is nighttime street photography in Japan. And the same thing applies for this image over here. The neutral variant looks quite nice without all those cold tones. Then the cobalt version looks fantastic once you apply a bit more intensity into the blues as well. And then finally, the emerald version gives this very nice street photography or modern look. So there you have it, guys. That's how I would achieve a similar type of color grading to Filipe Pinhas. Now, it's a real shame that all my photos, well, none of my photos are moody street photography, because I really wanted to draw a 1-1 comparison to see how they worked. But I guess that you guys will let me know down below how they work. Now, just as a reminder, these 4 presets are in the Edit Like preset pack V4, link up here to my shop. So if you can purchase anything over there and support me, I'll be very thankful. And if it's not in your possibilities, don't worry guys, just like the video, share it with a friend or share it on social media. That actually helps me out. I'm Tony Fuentes, cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.